Well, welcome along everybody to another episode of Monday Night Live. As you can see, the beard is gone, the hair has been cut. I made a bit of a fatal error actually today. I went and got a haircut today, and the fatal mistake that I made was not waiting until we were out of level 2. And so I was at the barber's. I spent about, 40 minutes standing outside in a queue. And then I spent quite a bit longer inside. And then finally, by the time we got through all the processes involved in level 2 and got my hair cut, a job that would sort of normally take me about 20 minutes took about 2 hours. But here I am nonetheless, looking lean, mean, and ready for tonight's interview, which I'm going to get into without any further ado. Welcome aboard, everybody. It's great to have you here. With us tonight on the show, we have Dr. Zachary Ardern. Zachary is a junior group leader in evolutionary genetics, leading the quote-unquote overlapping genes bioinformatics and evolution research group at the Technical University of Munich. He studies the origin of new genes in bacteria, and since January has been applying methods he has helped to develop for that to study the evolution of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. Before he completed his PhD in experimental evolution in New Zealand at the University of Auckland, where he was an undergrad, he studied biology, philosophy, and economics. He has spoken on his research and on issues pertaining to science and faith as well at universities around Europe, from Italy to Belarus. And with that introduction, how can we go wrong there? Let me bring in Zachary Ardern. Zach, good to have you with us, mate.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
All the way from Munich, eh?
Mm-hmm.
What's the weather doing there?
It's okay. It's probably much nicer in New Zealand.
Yeah. You haven't developed a German accent yet, so I think that's a good sign.
Yes.
Well, actually, I should say there's nothing wrong with the German accent, just in case anybody, in the troubled times that we live in right now, anybody misconstrued that. So let's just jump straight in. COVID-19, coronavirus, there's been so much conjecture, there's been so much information flying around about this. Let's sort of boil things back down to their basics if we can. In a nutshell, what is an R0 when you talk about a disease? And do we know yet what the actual R0 for COVID-19 actually is now?
Great question. Firstly, I guess I just want to say I'm a geneticist. So when I speak about genetics, I know what I'm talking about. When I speak about epidemiology, infectious disease control, I don't necessarily, but hopefully what I say is I'm trying to reflect what I think the consensus is from the people who are the experts.
Yeah.
What is an R0? Very important question. Lots of media interest, I guess, is about this because it's kind of presented as like a magic number that tells you what the virus is doing. The definition is that it's the expected number of new cases from a typical carrier in a population which hasn't been exposed to the disease. So it's kind of a theoretical number. It doesn't really reflect a particular empirical situation. It's because it's a number that's derived from models. It's a theoretical number. It's hard to pin down exactly, and that's why it's usually reported as a range. Yeah. It's not like a precise number. So defining accurately is a really technical issue, but basically you want that number to be below 1. Yeah. Naturally, because of the biology of the virus, or to be brought down below 1 by the control measures. And then when it's below 1, we can expect the case numbers will not be increasing anymore. Yeah. So as I understand it, in a lot of places it is currently below 1 because of the strict control measures. But its natural number without the controls is maybe around 4, but it varies widely.
Okay, so tell me, so the R0 is how many people an infected person would typically pass the disease on to, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
What is 4 in the context of things? Like what's a flu carrier? What's the R0 for flu or influenza or Ebola? Or what are some things that we could perhaps get our head around? Let's compare that to a little bit.
Right, that's a great question. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but this is one number that's important, which is the number that you're transmitting it to. But probably more important is what's the effect that it's having. So there's lots of things that spread very widely, very easily, but they're not very dangerous. So it's not really a problem. So I'd be much more concerned about what's the fatality rate, what's the serious of the incidence of serious disease. but basically viruses range widely. There's some that have that have higher R naught, but basically this one has a higher R naught. So most, as I understand, most viruses are lower, and this is one reason why it's a concern. Another reason is that it does cause very serious disease.
Okay, we're going to talk about fatality rate in a minute, what we know about that now. Can you just quickly, before we do that, can you explain what viral loading is? Because there was a theory floating around, or some evidence that people seem to be pointing to, which they thought indicated that if you got a higher viral loading, you would more likely to have a deadly outcome if you got COVID-19. So what is viral loading? Can you explain that? And is there still a belief that viral loading will have an impact on the outcomes for COVID-19 if you contract it?
Yeah, so it seems that there's two things here. You could split it into two. There's the infectious dose, which is basically the number of particles you get when someone transmits it to you. So maybe someone sneezes on you or something, you get heaps of virus, or maybe you just pick up a couple of particles in the air, or you touch something and then touch your face and you just get a very few particles. So that's the infectious dose. And the viral load, and sometimes people use these interchangeably, I guess, but viral load can also be used just for the number of viruses in your system at a particular time. So that can change over the course of an infection, I guess. Yeah. In general, there's definitely a correlation with viruses. It seems that the number of virus particles you get is likely to correspond to the severity of your disease. But it's not clear whether that's the case for COVID-19.
Okay.
So there's some evidence that it is related, and there's some evidence that it might be more complicated. But there has been a study showing a correlation with the amount of virus in your nose, so it's the virus load, and the severity of the disease that you get.
Okay. I guess things like population density might have a bearing on that too, right? In the sense that if you encountered more infected people, you would get an increased viral load if they breathed on you, right, at any given time.
So I guess people are particularly concerned with like people who work in hospitals, that kind of thing. They would get a higher viral load. So then they might get more serious disease from that. But it's, at least I haven't seen studies that really study this in a large population. So it's still not entirely clear.
Okay. There's been a lot of conjecture about fatality rates with COVID-19. Are we any closer to actually getting a handle on what the fatality rate is? I mean, obviously controlling for factors like if you social distance, obviously that reduces that rate. But what is the I don't know, the natural fatality rate? If it runs rampant, people get it. How likely are they to die? What's the range that it's sitting in, do we think now?
Yeah, so there's huge speculation on this, obviously, and kind of like the R naught, it's a very context-dependent value. So it depends particularly on the demographics of the population. So some countries just have different demographic structures. So they have lots of old people, or they have a particular age range, which is particularly prominent. So the fatality rate of probably any severe infectious disease is going to be super high if that gets into, say, a nursing home. And if your population resembles a nursing home more than another country's population does, so it has lots of old people, then you're going to have a higher fatality rate. Two things, again, you can distinguish the case fatality rate, which is the deaths among those who are diagnosed with the disease. So that will be pretty high. This is, again, it will depend on how the country is testing for it, but it's, for instance, those who are turning up to a hospital, they're going to have the serious disease already, obviously. A lot of those proportionally are going to die compared to the infection fatality rate, which is the fatality out of all of those that are infected in total, which includes a lot of asymptomatic cases, particularly for SARS-CoV-2. For this disease, it looks like it's very approximately 1%. So there's been definitely some claims that it's much lower, or claims that it's higher, but I think we're kind of stabilizing around a value of very approximately 1%. So not like 0.1% and not 10%.
So where does a seasonal flu sit in that range?
I believe that's below 0.1%.
Okay, so that is considerably higher then.
Yes, yeah. I mean, there's been debate on this, and because of different studies that have come out, but the consensus seems to be that some of the counts, for instance, of the proportion of the population that have the disease have been overstated.
Yeah.
And so when that happens, then you'll see the infection fatality rates going down if the proportion of the population who have it is much higher than we thought. But there seems to be, as the methods are improving and people are checking it, there's a general consensus that only a small proportion of the population have got it so far, and that helps to show that the infection fatality rate is reasonably high, around 1%.
Okay. Are there problems, because it seems there's a little bit of controversy that's starting to creep in now about the reliability of COVID-19 death rates, or deaths actually, in the sense that or in particular the way they're being recorded or who's being counted as a COVID-19 death. I read an article, for example, the other day by a pathologist who was raising concerns and said he was quite strong in his condemnation, actually, of the way some of this data is being handled. And we had the case in New Zealand about a week or so back where an elderly lady who was in a rest home developed COVID. She then goes to hospital. She passes 2 negative tests, so she's cleared, goes back to the rest home and dies several days later. But the family lobbied the government, and the government said, okay, we're going to count her as a COVID death. Is there a big issue here, or is it just around the fringes? How much of an issue is this?
My sense is that basically it's around the fringes because there's biases in both directions. So in some situations, maybe some hospitals or something will be over-reporting, potentially, but then there's a lot of cases where they simply aren't caught. So there's been a few studies showing that there has been a peak in total deaths in various countries, which hasn't been picked up in the COVID numbers. So there's a lot of people who are just dying at home, who haven't been diagnosed, who haven't been caught, but they've got it, and because they live alone or whatever, they're dying at home. So there is this peak in total deaths, which is suggesting there is a serious disease passing through the population, which means that I think it's pretty clear that the number of deaths has not been exaggerated. I mean, New Zealand is kind of a nice case study in that you can really probably track everyone in a much better way than you can in a place like New York, where you just really don't know exactly what's happening.
Yeah. So I've got a question related to that, because I was going to ask you then next about mutations, but someone has just asked on Facebook comments, do you think it would be an accurate statement to say that the death rate has been trending downward over time? So in March, it was around 3.5% or thereabouts, for example. And now it's obviously, you're saying it's not that high. And related to that, I guess, the question I was going to ask is, can you explain mutations and strains a little bit here? Because there seems to be a bit of confusion about that, what that means here. So give us that in layman's terms. And has COVID-19 mutated? Is it becoming less contagious or more contagious? Or more deadly or less deadly? What's happening on that front?
Yeah, so on the death rate, that I guess that's fully expected because we're testing more people, so we're catching a bigger proportion of the population who have actually had it. So we have a better sense of what the death rate is. Yeah. So I don't think anyone's really surprised that the rate is coming down. Like it was super high in Italy, for instance, when they were overwhelmed and they were only catching the most serious cases. But then as things have kind of evened out, we've got a better sense, I think, of the total number of people who have got it. But I think the most important thing is not dropping to like seasonal flu levels or such, which people have kind of. Some people have been saying it's not serious. It's basically just like the flu. I think that where the value is stabilizing at is much higher than that. Okay. As far as I can tell, mutations, strains. I guess this is more my area, so I could talk for ages on this. But so give us the layman's version. What? Because sure. We've watched a few viral movies, we've watched the zombie outbreak films. We all know about mutating strains, and we think it's all getting worse. But in actual fact, I've read articles recently that indicate people are confusing terminology here, and it doesn't always mean that it's going to get worse. Yeah, so I mean, everything is constantly mutating, I guess, especially viruses. They're mutating at a high rate. This virus is pretty interesting because it's actually mutating at a really low rate. So coronaviruses in general, they don't mutate very much. And that was actually annoying for us as people studying the disease because it means there's not much happening. It's pretty boring. So we weren't getting enough diversity to test the stuff that we wanted to test, even with thousands and thousands of genomes. Yep. When we first looked at this, there was a few hundred genomes. Now there's tens of thousands of genomes. Yeah. And there's still not that much diversity that's happening. So there's a few mutations, but so mutations just mean changes. Most of them are very minor. Most of them do basically nothing, as far as we can tell, as far as the biology of the virus is concerned. So diversity is slowly accumulating in different places across the globe. And then once enough diversity starts to accumulate, you can cluster the genomes and say, okay, this cluster in America, this is strain A. This cluster in Africa is strain B, or whatever. So you can call these strains, but that doesn't really mean anything. It just means that there's some genetic diversity there. It doesn't mean that it's going to be more severe or less severe. It could be either. Yeah. With some viruses, there has been a tendency to decrease. Yeah. If anything, that seems more likely, the tendency. But again, this is actually massively debated, whether there's a general evolutionary pressure towards that. And because this virus is still very young, hasn't been around the human population for that long, there's not really any reason to expect it to be being selected in a particular direction. So basically, there's no evidence that I'm aware of that really shows either more severe or less severe. There have been one or two studies, but they've been basically destroyed by the experts.
Okay, so here's a question for you then, and Andrew's just fired one, and it relates to what I was about to ask actually. So Andrew said, to what extent can inaccurate statistics be attributed to the use of real-time and point-of-care testing as against PCR testing? Some of these PCR tests, notably those produced by the German company Eurominim, is it exceed 98% specificity and sensitivity? I was going to ask, when can we start to expect to get our head around how long does it take us to figure out with a novel virus these parameters that we're talking about here, now fatality rates and mutations and strains, and what's the normal time period to start getting our head into some reliable data?
I guess usually it would take longer. This virus is unusual in that there's been so much attention poured into it. There's so much money poured into it. So the technology is just in the last few years has got better. So this is just the right time if you're studying viruses, I guess. So we know a lot more about this a lot faster than most diseases. So I think we are definitely getting a good sense of we have a good sense of the mutation rate, for instance. We have a good sense of how fast it's evolving. We just don't have any evidence that it's evolving in an interesting way, that it's changing the biology. And I think we are getting a reasonable sense on the fatality rates and that kind of thing. So we're kind of in that zone now, I'd say.
All right.
In terms of statistics question, I guess I'm not too sure about that, but there's just a huge diversity of tests out there that different countries are doing. But when we're averaging across that, then because of this huge diversity, that's actually helping us get a good sense, I think, of we can have some trust in the statistics because they're being repeated with different tests now.
The predictive modelling for COVID-19 now seems to have been highly questionable. Now, I don't mean people saying things like, "Oh, well, no one really died, or not too many people died in New Zealand, and it wasn't that bad," because they're not accounting for being locked down and social distancing. But even when you account for that stuff, like for example, if I'm understanding some of those key predictive models correctly, Sweden by now should have had about 90,000 deaths. It hasn't even got close to that. Obviously, it's a lot higher than its neighbours because of the approach they've taken. But it does seem, even when you account for some of those factors like social distancing, that maybe the modelling didn't do that, or like, what is there likely to be any sort of accountability for some of this stuff? Like, if a researcher published dodgy research, they'd really get challenged for it. What happens with modelling?
So I guess I'm really not an expert on the modeling, but modeling is just another kind of research, I guess I'd say. And there's probably less accountability than people might expect for research in general. So there's a lot of crap research that gets published and people kind of know it's not that great, and they just ignore it and move on and do their own. If it's in a major journal, if it's really important, then it might be challenged. And I guess that's what we're seeing recently with the hydroxychloroquine stuff, which we'll come on to in a bit, I think. So some really big claims will get challenged, but there's not much in the way of like punishment or such, because I think it's not the case that people were lying or were had bad motives. It's just sometimes we don't understand enough to make a good model.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it seems to me too, one thing that does seem to be consistent is the suggestion that they didn't account for how much of an effect even just social distancing, not lockdowns, but even just basic social distancing, for example, or contact tracing that was done well could actually, help in you're removing infected people from a population. And so some of those worst case scenarios really were, I mean, even in New Zealand, for example, I remember the Prime Minister after lockdown saying, even despite the lockdown, we're still expecting that we will climb into the thousands of cases in the next 2 weeks. And that didn't happen. And then, of course, at the tail end, just last week, she said the tail end is very different to what the modelling told us it was going to be. So, there's obviously a lot of unknowns here, right?
Yeah, well, it's super hard to model human beings, I guess. We're not just bits of data on a screen that you can predict what's exactly going to happen. So, the world is changing. People don't act now as necessarily in the same way they would have acted before. There's so many factors there. So it probably is safer to be on the more cautious side.
Yeah.
So in that sense, that's been good. I mean, that may have other fallouts, which is not really a topic for virus experts, but for society in general to talk about what are the bigger fallouts of that.
Yeah. Okay, I've got a question coming here. We're going to talk about the vaccine question in a minute, but someone, Seb has asked, Sebastian said, long shot political question. Is it sensible to keep New Zealand's borders closed until a vaccine is developed? As someone who deals in the, this arena of viruses and things, do we have to learn to live with it, or is this such a freak out of the box that we've just got to take extreme measures?
Yeah, that's a great question. I wish I knew. I'm pretty biased here because I want to come back to New Zealand at some point. I would like to visit my family and such. But so I'm hoping the borders are opened. I guess I'm hoping that those who hopefully testing will be good enough and efficient enough that you can show I don't have the virus and then I can travel. But yeah, it's really unclear what that will look like and whether countries will get the systems in place to be able to do that. Yeah. But conceivably, it could be done safely. Whether it can be done at a massive enough scale to make it actually practical, that's unclear. But it is a very serious virus, and there could still be a second wave in Europe, in Asia. We really don't know what's going to happen in the next few months.
Yeah, so someone's asked about that here in the scientific community. Does anyone in the scientific community actually believe the stats coming out of China? Because that's a factor, right? A confounding problem here is that what we thought we knew, we discovered we didn't know.
Well, I guess I do, but I'm not really an expert. But I do, insofar as they do. The trends that you see in China are also replicated in other places that did similar things. Okay. So, from my looking at it, there's not something massively surprising. They could be doctoring the data. Who knows? But more important is that we see similar things in other places. So we're not just relying on the data from China for any of our conclusions that I'm aware of. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Let's get into that then. One of the controversial questions is. What are the origins of this thing? Now, it's been almost exactly 3 months. It will be on the 12th. I think it's been 3 months since the World Health Organization declared a global pandemic here. Do we know any more about the origins of this virus than what we did 3 months ago?
I think since March, we've got better evidence that this did come from a bat. So there have been other theories that have been passed around over the first 2 or 3 months, January, February, March, I guess. Yeah. But there's been a couple new sequences that have come out of other bat viruses that have got closer and closer to this virus, to SARS-CoV-2. So, yeah, I think that's the direction that it's pointing, that it did come from a bat and it had a natural source. Exactly how it passed into humans, there's various options there. Yeah. But basically, we're getting a better sense, and this was fully expected by people who work in this area, that there would be more bat viruses that would pass into humans. Yes,
but what about those who have? I read an article just the other day, someone from the scientific community, so it's not the MI6 guy, someone else saying that looking at the structure of the virus, they thought that just the way it was, that it was too coincidental. It was too coincidental to have been a sort of naturally evolving thing. Others, though, in that same article said that they questioned that. They thought it still could be naturally explained, didn't require any sort of human design or deliberate intent here. So we're starting to get a sense, are you saying that it's more likely that it is actually naturally something that's evolved in the wild?
Yeah, I mean, it looks very much like other bat viruses.
Yeah.
There's one region that people say might have possibly come from pangolins, and that's very possible because viruses are constantly mixing, so they're recombining, and so that's fully expected. There's nothing that looks designed. There's nothing that looks artificial. So it's not clear exactly how it got into the human population, exactly what kind of bat virus it came from.
Yeah.
And maybe there was some recombination involved, but there's not any evidence that it was anything other than what's constantly happening in bat viruses.
So that doesn't exclude, though, does it, the possibility that it still was something natural that was in a lab being experimented with for no nefarious reasons, just people trying to possibly even find cures for things, that has somehow got out of a lab. It's still not excluded, is it? Is that right?
Yeah, for sure. So any time that someone is in contact with bats, they're potentially catching bat viruses, I guess. And so that could be in a lab setting. It could be any setting where you just happen to brush against something that a bat has left or whatever. So there's heaps of ways that this could have come. I'm not aware of any evidence that it did specifically come from a lab, other than like very circumstantial things. Yeah.
What about China destroying the samples? How significant is that? Is that a genuine safety measure that you would say if you were working in a lab in that scenario, let's destroy them, or is that extremely questionable?
I guess I don't really work with virus samples enough to know what's standard there. Yeah. So I mean, you could argue either way, I guess. Yeah. And I don't really have an opinion on that.
Yeah, fair enough. That's spoken like a true scientist.
Yeah.
Tell me, why is it so important that we actually try and find the origins? Because a lot of talk about this, the importance of finding the source, the origins, patient zeros, all those kind of things. Why is it important? Does it matter that much if we never find that out, or is there a big advantage in that?
I think there's just an advantage for preventing future outbreaks, particularly if it was if there was some risky behavior involved in some way, like illegal wildlife trading, or maybe it was something tied to research, or so if there was some human behavior that could be avoided, like if it did come from the wet market, for instance, then we could say, okay, we should shut down wet markets, for instance. So it would be good to know if it's something avoidable. I think that's the main outcome.
So there's a lot of conjecture now floating around, or there has been, about, certainly in the mainstream media anyway, about will antibodies actually develop in people after they've had a COVID infection? Because obviously that's quite important for whether you can actually kill it with a vaccine or whether you can, you're protected against it in future. What does the data indicate at the moment? What's it pointing to? Is it pointing to that antibodies are there? Are they temporary? Are they permanent? Or are they not there at all?
Yeah, so there's definitely an antibody response, and the question is whether it's a long-term, whether there's a long-term memory of that. And I'm not at all an expert in the immune system, but my understanding is that in general these responses do last over the long term. So your kind of background assumption is that they would.
Yeah.
And there has been kind of debate on this, but I haven't seen good evidence that they don't.
Yeah.
So from the experts that I've seen comment on it, they expect that they would. And also helpful, a problem with some viruses is that they're mutating really fast. So even though you've got antibodies to the previous form, to last year's virus, that's not going to help you next year. With this virus, this is less of a problem because it's not mutating so fast. So that's another reason to be hopeful that antibodies will survive and be useful, and you'll have continued immunity once you've got the infection.
Okay, so I suppose that would be better too for if you were to develop a vaccine that, unlike say the flu, you're constantly having to adapt it for the previous season. If it's slower, then that wouldn't be as much of an issue, right?
Yeah, so I'm not sure. Maybe one season's worth would be enough. It depends on what you're targeting with the vaccine and how fast that particular thing is mutating. But in general, it gives you some hope of longer term immunity.
Can we ever expect a vaccine? Because that's another thing now. We've been trying for over 10 years, I think, to actually develop one for coronavirus, any coronavirus, and not succeeded. Or should we perhaps put more funding into therapeutic interventions to try and reduce severity and fatalities? What are we going to get a vaccine, and where should the pressing concern be, do you think, right now?
Yeah, so the comments I've seen on that are optimistic. One of the reasons that there hasn't been a vaccine against other coronaviruses is some coronaviruses are involved in the common cold, but there's a few different viruses there. So if you just targeted one of those, you would have a very low impact on common cold in general. So there's not much kind of financial or economic incentive to develop a vaccine against a specific common cold virus if you're only going to remove 10% of the common cold risk or whatever. So this one has more interest behind it because it's such a serious disease and because it can be clearly shown to be the cause. And so my understanding is there has been veterinary coronavirus vaccines. So if you can do it in animals, there's also good reason to think you can do it in humans. So I don't think there's a general problem, and most of the experts I see are pretty optimistic that we will have a vaccine.
Okay, another big question then is, well, it certainly made a lot of headlines anyway, is hydroxychloroquine. There was a study that came out a couple of weeks ago, I remember it made a lot of news, I think probably because of the political implications of it, that was saying that in actual fact our study has shown that there's an increased rate of death for people using it. In the last week, that study has been retracted over data concerns. What does that mean for the findings? Is it normal for studies to be pulled like this? Is it normal for people to say, we're not going to show you our data sources? What does this actually mean?
Yeah, so it's not normal for such a high profile study. So a certain low percentage of studies are retracted regularly, but it's a low percentage, and it's not very often, obviously, that it happens in such a high profile case. I don't know enough about the way that hospital data specifically is used, but a lot of the experts are saying this is unusual. Part of the problem is that there is a big rush to publish these high-profile SARS-CoV-2 studies because there's so much interest. So a lot of people are saying there's peer review has kind of failed in this case, and there's been other recent publications on this virus that are low quality, and the experts are all saying, how did this get published? So some of the journals are kind of rushing to publish stuff. That's part of the problem. What does this mean? It just means that those results can't be trusted, but it doesn't mean the opposite is true. So it doesn't mean that the drug is effective. It just means that the evidence that was claimed that it's dangerous is not reliable.
Okay, so then at this stage, do we have any handle on what a non-partisan, non-politicized assessment of hydroxychloroquine would actually indicate about its usefulness?
So my understanding is that there was just a very recent study, and it also come out in the last few days that was showing that it's not effective. So there were small trials early on that weren't very well controlled that did claim a positive effect. And there's been kind of, I think, a few small studies going either way since then. But my understanding is there was just recently a large one that showed it's not effective. So the consensus among experts seems to be pretty skeptical. There are other drug possibilities as well. So I'm I guess optimistic that with all the drug trials going on that they will find something that's helpful. There's just not good evidence that this one is particularly useful.
But that could shift, right? Because like you've just said, we're dealing with an environment where things are being pushed through at a great rate of knots, and possibly the usual sort of controls and methodology is not being perhaps adhered to. You can't get big sample sizes, all those kind of things. That this could change, right? Potentially in another 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah, so I think we're just in a zone where we're starting to see some of these bigger studies coming out. So this is more reliable, particularly when you can actually go back and look at the original data. So the one that was retracted was highly suspicious because the data was not available. But so long as researchers can go back and check the data, then that will be much more reliable.
Okay, data, and I realise you're on a time budget here, so I'm trying to get through these questions, not hold you. I mean, you're at Munich University, at the University of Munich, you can't be held back. So tell me, face masks. In America, they're saying got to wear them, or lots of America is saying got to wear them. In New Zealand, we were told no, don't wear them. They don't do anything. What does the data say about face masks?
Again, I'm not really an expert on this, so I'm not sure on studies on SARS-CoV-2 specifically. I think that there's basically evidence in both. There's not much evidence that they're very helpful.
Yeah.
And some people say, well, if people wear them, then they become too confident. And but the general consensus seems to be that it should, if someone is infectious, it should limit the spread a bit. What that does on the population level is less clear. Okay. So it's still debated as far as I understand.
Okay. Related to that, because we're talking about transmission, the CDC a couple of weeks ago, there was a reclassification, or certainly that's what the media was saying, about the risk of transmission via surfaces. They were saying they thought it was a lot lower than previously stated. Remember at the beginning, everyone was talking about washing your vegetables and all sorts of stuff from the supermarket. Has the scientific consensus shifted on surfaces and how transmittable it is, or what happened there?
Yeah, I think there is a good sense now that it's that's not the main source of infections. That most infections are through droplets in the air. So some surfaces that are touched by a lot of people regularly, they are still a risk, but that's not the main source. So they're not the main risk. So I think things like washing veggies and stuff is not so. I mean, you should do that anyway, but you don't need to like wash it with special chemicals or anything. Basically the main risk is breathing in droplets that people have recently breathed out.
Yeah.
And
sorry, carry on.
No, sorry, that's it. Yeah. So testing stuff is not a huge risk.
Yeah. Okay. So we can all stop being paranoid about the courier drivers. Tell me, has the scientific consensus about hand sanitizer changed? Now, the reason I ask this is because I remember we all do at the very beginning. It was like we were told very clearly in New Zealand, no, don't use hand sanitizer. Wash your hands, warm soapy water, sing happy birthday twice, do it as you leave, as you come back from, all those kind of things. And now, as part of the restrictions in level 3 and 2, it's like, hand sanitizer at the door of a business is fine. Was this because there wasn't enough hand sanitizer to go around? Has the consensus changed? What's gone on there?
Oh, I mean, I'm not sure what's underlying the specific claims there, but in general, soap is better. So chemically, just soap destroys the virus, whereas hand sanitizer, it depends what percentage alcohol it has as to how effective it will be. So we know that soap works because it breaks down the lipid bilayer, it annihilates it. Hand sanitizers still effective, but it's probably less effective depending on exactly what kind of hand sanitizer you have. So it's just safer to use soap. Yeah. But both of them are fine. So if you don't have soap, hand sanitizer is fine. But I think a lot of people, they assume that hand sanitizer is better because it seems more kind of specialized. It seems more scientific to kill the germs with hand sanitizer. So a lot of hand sanitizer companies love that, I'm sure. But strangely, just normal soap is actually better in this case.
There you go, Mother Nature, sort of. Tell me, just a couple of questions to finish up with. There, obviously, we've ended now. As of I think it's midnight tonight. Level 2 is over. Too long, in my opinion, but here we are. So there's a lot of talk now in New Zealand about the fact that the lockdown, it's eliminated COVID. Is it also possible, or isn't it also possible that perhaps in New Zealand we're dealing with a situation where it wasn't quite as virulent or as widespread as we initially thought? Could that also be a reason why we haven't even seen, forget about Italy or New York, we just haven't seen as much of it as was expected?
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to tell. I mean, it's probably not any difference in the virus. It's just the number of cases that there were. But also just New Zealanders live differently to people in New York or other large cities, and the demographics are different to Italy. So, yeah, whether there's an effect of like climate, for instance, is possible. Whether there's an effect of just how the living lifestyle that people have. Like New Zealand is pretty low density compared to most countries. So probably New Zealand was low risk for a bunch of reasons to start with, because we're an island, because people live low density. But there was still the risk that could spread massively. So it was spreading a fair amount through community cases in Australia, and that was quite surprising for people, even in that it would spread in summer in a relatively low density population like Australia. So there was that risk, and early on people just didn't really know how widely it was going to spread. So it was good that there was a lockdown, and people can definitely debate the details of how long it should have gone for and stuff. But some kind of distancing was good and had the right effect.
Tell me, just a last question, because this has now become a very highly politicized pandemic. How do you feel as a scientist about that? Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess in general as a scientist, I think science should be bipartisan. So it's dangerous for science when science gets associated with a particular political brand, because when that brand goes out of favor, then science goes out of favor, and that's not in my interest in having government funding, and it's not in society's interest in having good responses to viruses and stuff. So I think it's in everyone's interest that that science is seen as somehow kind of separate to politics, and that scientists are seen as not being overly interested in one particular political direction or not. So I'm not a fan of some scientists, including some in New Zealand, who've been a little bit too clear on where their political persuasions lie, I guess. I think that actually discredits science. Someone who's done a really good job of that, who I'd like to highlight, is Francis Collins, the director of the National Institutes of Health in the States. And he was one of the very few people who was appointed by both Obama and Trump. And it was because he had just had such massive bipartisan support. And because of that, even under an administration which is generally thought to be kind of anti-science, my understanding is that the budget for his institution still went up because he had bipartisan support from across the Congress. So that's the kind of person that you want leading science, and that's the kind of person that hopefully politicians will trust, someone who's not seen as being associated with either brand.
That's a whole nother conversation, isn't it, right, for another day, because we are going to have you back on, Dr. Zachary Ardern, to speak about the whole area of faith and science, and no doubt morality as well, because there are some big moral questions about how, in a situation like this, what's the role that scientists should play and all those kind of things. But we're going to unpack that at a future date. In the meantime, I know that you're a busy man over there in Munich, studying the actual virus, doing the Lord's work, as they say, on the front lines of it all. So thank you so much for taking the time to actually be with us tonight. Yeah,
it was great to be here. So thanks, Brendan.
Cheers, mate. I look forward to having you back again in future, and we'll talk about the big question. As I said at the start, before we even got started, I said to Zachary, who ever thought that a discussion about faith and science would be less controversial than a discussion about a major pandemic? But it turns out that is probably going to be the case. So, Zach, thanks again, mate, and we'll see you around.
Cool, thank you.
When we wake, hear the birds and see the sun. Side by side, our fears are done. All the good times just begun. We know what we have, let's hold on tight. Found what we're looking for in life. Call us crazy, but things are finally right. With you and I, the future is